In the 4th chapter of the book of John, there's a conversation that takes place between Jesus and the woman that we know as the woman at the well. She was a Samaritan woman, and therefore her background, her religious background, had actually been kind of a diluted Judaism in the past. And it had come to the point that the things that the Samaritans believed were not exactly what the rest of the Jews believed. And that became very apparent in the conversation that they were having. One of the things that they talked about, that this woman brought up, was the fact that they believed differently. Some things having to do with worship. I want to read to you from John chapter 4, verses 22 through 24. Because this morning we're going to touch on an element of worship that needs to be addressed. And I want to share this with you to set our minds in the right direction. Please stand. Listen to these words from Jesus himself teaching us about worship. As Jesus was speaking to her, he said this, "You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth."
This time, our children ages 2 through kindergarten can be dismissed to their Bible hour, and as they exit the auditorium, we will sing a song with them. Blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven are what I can see. When my Lord is living in me, I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He makes his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone, since he promised me that we never would part. For Pat's lesson, we'll sing 583, Jesus Flow Like a River. You are the river of life, you are the joy of my soul, you are the raging river out of control, riding the waves of your glory to depths of joy I've not known, release a deeper flooding in my soul. Jesus, flow like a river, deeper than the sea in me. Take me to the deepest ocean of your heart and let me go. Plunge me deeper than your living water flow. Never a river so peaceful, never a river so pure, never have I known cleansing so deep and so sure. Never a river so peaceful while raging out of control, but now I found what satisfies my soul. Jesus, flow like a river, deeper than the sea in me. Take me to the deepest ocean of your heart and let me go. Plunge me deeper than your living water flow. Jesus, flow like a river, deeper than the sea in me. Take me to the deepest ocean of your heart and let me go. Plunge me deeper than your living water flow. Plunge me deeper than your living water flow. Please be seated.
This is a teaching lesson. There is one particular thing that I want to teach about this morning. And let me tell you this, I'm anxious to do this. I'm anxious to share this teaching. There are going to be some that are going to say, well, do we really need to be talking about that? Well, actually, this lesson has come about because a number of you have requested it. And therefore, I bring this to you. And as I said, I'm very glad to do this. I am also anxious to move on to something that is going to be talked about next week. If you want to be a part of something that's quite possibly going to be a part of our conversation once we are in heaven, if you want to be a part of that right now, I urge you to be here next week. Because I believe that we are going to start talking about, I know we're going to talk about something next week that is vital, absolutely vital in the life of the church. And yet there is this topic that I want to pursue today. In your order of worship, it says hot button issues. Well, let me tell you, church, I've been wrestling with this for several weeks. There are a list of hot button issues. They're controversial, emotional, social issues that are before us, and I want to address those things. But I got thinking, if I do this in a series, people are going to dry up and blow away in about 3 weeks, because I'm afraid it would be too heavy and people would not walk out of here being uplifted and encouraged. And I want you to walk out of here uplifted and encouraged. Now, we're going to deal with those hot button issues, but we're going to do it kind of sporadically along the way. But I want, again, to say that this lesson is going to be because several of you have requested it, and I promise to honor that request. But as I say, I'm anxious to do this because this particular topic, and I know you're ready for me to tell what it is, but this particular topic needs to be addressed in the sight of us all, so that we are all on the same page. Here's the topic. We're going to talk this morning about instrumental music in worship. Now, it is something by which we are most known in the community, in the world. Those are the people that don't use a piano. And there's some underlying thoughts here. First of all, I understand very clearly no one is going to decide today, I'm ready to commit my life to Jesus because this church doesn't use a piano. I know that. But there's a deeper underlying idea that does need to be addressed. And we need to be, as I said, on the same page. Beneath this practice of us singing purely acapella singing, there is a deeper and an important principle. Now, let me say this also to anybody who is visiting here. This may be the first time you've ever been in a worship where we didn't have a piano or an organ or some such musical instruments. And it may seem a little strange to you. I know the first time that I came in contact with it, it was most strange. I just didn't understand whatsoever. And I don't talk about this very much. We don't preach about this very much. I think the world probably thinks that we talk about it every week, but we don't. But we do underscore the underlying principle of this to a great degree. We don't harp on this. We don't harp on this much because on the surface, it really is kind of a surface issue. Because there's more things that we need to delve into. This morning I want to present the case for the church practicing purely a cappella singing in worship. The reasons I do this, the reason I bring you this today is I know that there are some of you here this morning that are absolutely convinced we should not use musical instruments in worship. And if asked about it, you can present your case clearly and you are convicted about that and you can convict others about that. But I also know that there's some here that don't think that we ought to use them. But if you ask about it, you really don't have an answer. You just, well, we just don't. Or there's some answer that doesn't really address what people are asking about. There's some probably here this morning that really don't, I know there's some that probably really don't care whether we would have an instrument or not. And then there are some that might even wish that we did. Well, for this reason, we need to be on the same page. I would urge you, if there are people that have asked this question or wondering about this question, I would urge you to tell them to go to our YouTube and watch this lesson this morning. Because there are reasons for us to practice singing the way that we do. Let me show you some of those reasons. Comes in 3 reasons. Actually, 1 is all that's necessary. And the first reason is this, simply the meaning of words. Ephesians 5 verse 19 says this, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody with your heart to the Lord. Now look at that verse carefully. I want to point out some specific words here. First of all, it says that our singing is speaking to one another. That's the voice, okay? We are speaking to one another. For what purpose? Because we're actually teaching, we're encouraging each other in this, and we do it with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Let me tell you that even in New Testament times, the difference between those 3 things was not clear. Those words are almost used synonymously. Psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Now, also in this verse, it says singing and making melody. If we look at the original language there, I love this. It's actually saying singing and psalming. This is what we do when we're together. We're singing and we're psalming. And there's 2 words that are used in this description. One is the word psallo, P-S-A-L-L-O, that looks like our word for psalms. Okay? And that's actually what psalms is. It is a songbook that was used by them in worship. But the meaning of that word changed over a period of time. When in the etymology of that word, as we look at the history of that word, the earliest meaning was to pluck, like plucking the strings on a musical instrument. Okay? But the meaning of that word changed. Meanings of words change in some languages. Our English language certainly has words change in their meaning to a great degree. And we could make a long list of those. But here in the Greek language, it changed to the point that in the 1st century, the meaning of that word was sing without musical accompaniment. It was an evolutionary change over a number of centuries, as a matter of fact, but that clearly is what it meant in the 1st century. The instruction was to sing only. The other word that is used there is the word ado. And interestingly, in that, it was sometimes used with, particularly ado, solo too, sometimes used with another little word, in. You would ado in and then name the musical instrument. You would sing with a particular musical instrument. Well, interestingly, here it uses that. We are to sing, and the instrument is the heart. So we have the meanings of those words that are pointing at pure, what we call acapella singing. Let me show you Colossians 3:16. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, and with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Almost the same instruction given to the Colossian church here. But again, the instruction is using the word, particularly the word solo, which at that time meant to sing without the use of instruments. Hang on to that as we look at reason 2. And that reason 2 is the practice of how the early Christians carried out those instructions that we read in Ephesians and Colossians. They were told to sing. Okay, how did the early Christians sing? We know that they did not use musical instruments, and I'll address that more. But let me show you some of the specific things that early Christians wrote about the practice of singing without instruments. Now, this is not scripture, but it is early Christian writing, and it's touching on their understanding of the kind of singing that they were supposed to practice. Clement of Alexandria was an elder in the church in Alexandria, Egypt, and he wrote toward the end of the 2nd century, and this is what he wrote: "The one instrument of peace, the word alone by which we honor God, is what we employ. We no longer employ the ancient psaltery, the trumpet, the timbrel, the flute, which those expert in war and contemners of the fear of God were wont to make use of also in the choruses at their festive assemblies, that by such strains they might raise their dejected minds." Now, the writing here is funny, and some of the words are a little funny. It's different than what we would use. But what he was pointing out was that Christians no longer sang like the rest of the world did. The rest of the world was using these instruments. Particularly, he was pointing out those who were expert in war and those that were, the word he uses is contemners. We could easily insert the word condemners of the fear of God. But the point that Clement was making was that Christians don't sing like the rest of the world, and one of the distinctions of that is that we no longer use instruments. Philo, another early Christian writer, this actually even in the 1st century, and he said this: "The word of God, despising the lyre and harp, which are but lifeless instruments, and having tuned the universe by the Holy Spirit, and especially man, makes melody to God on this instrument of many tones, and to this instrument, I mean man, he sings accordingly, for thou art my harp and pipe and temple." We no longer use the instruments. We now use simply the voice of man in this singing. Niceta, who was an elder in the church in what we now call Serbia, he wrote this, and in this he was talking about the things that have changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament. We're under a different covenant, and so there were some changes in worship. And this is what he's getting at. It is time to turn to the New Testament to confirm what is said in the Old, and particularly to point out that the office of psalmody is not to be considered abolished merely because many other observances of the old law have fallen into desuetude. Desuetude. That's a word that we don't use, but basically it is disuse. Only the corporal institutions have been rejected, like circumcision, the Sabbath, sacrifices, discrimination in foods. So too the trumpets, harps, cymbals, and timbrels. For the sound of these we now have a better substitute in the music from the mouths of men. Okay, early Christian writers wrote against the use of instruments. We have said on a number of occasions that it was 600 years before any instruments were used in Christian worship. Actually, the better evidence is really pointing at the fact that it was more like 1,000 years. 10 centuries of no instrumental music used in Christian worship. And then, when it was introduced, it was met with great opposition, and it always caused division. And then we carry Christian history on up into the 1500s when the Protestant Reformation began. And some of those reformers by that time because they were guided by the Roman Church, everybody was using instruments. But under the Reformation, a number of them went back to the non-use of instruments. There were a few groups that held on to the use, but most of them rejected the use of instruments. And the reason they rejected was because they were trying to be more biblical. They were trying to go back and be the church that was in the first century. Some of the reformers' condemnations were strong, emotional. In the minds of many of those reformers, there's no place in Christian worship for the use of musical instruments. Those who reverted back to the non-use of instruments, they did so because they wanted to reform things back to a more biblical standard. So we have the meaning of the words, and then we see that the early church, in response to the meaning of those words, did not use the instruments. I stick this in, and I'm not sure this is classified as a reason, but it's an interesting note. I put down reason number 3, the meaning of acapella. Acapella. That's the way it is written. That's what we are talking about. If you look up acapella in the dictionary, what you will find is singing as in the style of the church, singing without instrumental accompaniment. As in the style of the church. What does that say? It says that in the church, they didn't use instruments. Now, I want to emphasize a few points. Singing a cappella is not, please understand this, it is not just a Church of Christ tradition. I hear that phrase used. Well, this is our tradition. Well, no, it is not just a tradition. I have lost dear friends from the church because they had someone convince them that this was just a tradition that we followed. Well, 10 centuries of Christianity kind of underscored how they were following the meaning of those early words. And yet we today are not the only ones that worship in this way. There are other groups, but most notably, a very large, influential group around the world, not so much so in our part of the world, but the Greek Orthodox Church does not use instruments. You know why? Because of the meaning of words. The New Testament was written in Greek. Who would better understand the meaning of Greek words than the Greek Orthodox Church? And their conclusion was that they would not use instruments. But, somebody says, it doesn't say not to use instruments. Well, that's true. There is not a command of condemnation against instrumental music in the New Testament. But I might also point out there are not any verses or passages that support using them. Actually, the commands to sing and the instructions of how to sing is the condemnation of instruments. The affirmation of our viewpoint on this is simply the way that the people understood this. And when the people were told to sing and how to sing, that really was the condemnation of the instruments itself. The New Testament does not have a thou shalt not on this. But the early Christians did. As we saw in their writings, they in effect said thou shalt not, because they understood what was being said. And then somebody else comes along and says, but instruments were used in the Old Testament. Absolutely true. Numbers 10:10. Also in the day of your gladness and in your appointed feasts and on the first days of your months, You shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, and they shall be a reminder of you before your God. I am the Lord your God. Absolutely, in Leviticus, instruments were used in worship. No question. In the book of 2nd Chronicles, in chapter 29, it's very specific about instructions for singing and the use of instruments. There is no question that they were used in the Old Testament. Temple worship was also accompanied by instruments. And so here's the background we have. The background of worship clearly has instruments used in the Old Testament, but clearly not used in the New. Early Christians, the first Christians, from the time of Pentecost on, did not use the instruments. So what changed? Why was there a change in worship procedure? It had to be because of the understanding of what the language was telling them to do. I hear so many members of the church say, well, the New Testament just doesn't say anything about it. Yes, it did. In the use of the word solo, it said specifically what kind of singing we are to do. And singing, by the way, is mentioned a number of times in the New Testament. Maybe not as many as you would expect, but a number of times. And it is always with that word, either solo or ado, but most often with solo. You see, when we worship, we come before God on our terms. Worship is what we offer to God. We do not do whatever we want and imagine that it's pleasing to God when He has in fact instructed us otherwise. And so we get back to John 4:24. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth. This is why we do what we do. This is why we practice this seemingly odd thing in the eyes of the world. It's because what was instructed at first. So, summing this up, why don't we use instruments? Because of the original words of instruction concerning singing in worship. Because of the example of the early church in rejecting the use of instruments. Because of the writings of the early Christians. Because of the meaning of acapella. Because we desire to worship in ways that are instructed, in which we are instructed, and ways that are pleasing to God, and because we want to worship in spirit and truth. And then we could add to this things that are not as scriptural in their basis and yet interesting things. This is a wonderful practice that we do because a cappella singing truly is attractive to the world. The world loves a cappella singing because a cappella singing is instructive and encouraging. We are speaking to one another in this way. Because a cappella singing is distinctive, apart from the music of the world. It makes sense that in sacred worship, our music would in some way be different. This is the way that God said be different. And because a cappella singing can be done in every culture, in every place, demonstrating the pattern of New Testament instruction, it is universal. And we can always practice this. That's the reasons. Now let me close with this and say, if you have questions about this, please come talk to me. If there are more inquiries that need to be made, let's talk about them. If you want to look into this more deeply, I have some specific books that I can recommend for you to take a look at. But I am more convinced than ever of the purity of this instruction and the purity of the results of this instruction. I am proud of the fact that we do not use instruments. Now, do I hate instrumental music? Absolutely not. I've said before, I love Dixieland jazz. I love listening to wonderful music. But worship music is to be different. And the instruction from the New Testament is sing. I know that this is not the kind of lesson that makes somebody just say, well, that's it. That's my conviction to follow Christ. I want you to have a conviction to follow Christ. But I also want us to all be on the same page in the way that we do that. Church, there should be no hesitation. We should not be ashamed. We should glory in this factor that he has given us a way to be distinctive in our worship. And he set this forth for us. If we can help you right now, maybe, apart from this lesson, maybe you are ready to commit your life to Christ. Maybe you need to take some other spiritual step that needs to be done in the presence of this family together. Whatever the case, today is a day for us to take another step forward in being disciples of Jesus Christ. And if we can help you in your journey, come right now. Let's stand and sing.
Just as I am without one plea, but that